be my neighbor.
Good.
Welcome to the
So has anybody read the Rotten.com expose on the secret life of Mr. Rogers? Because there were these rumors going around that Mr. Rogers was like a sniper, and that he had killed upwards of 100 men in cold blood. And not just a sniper, but that, you know, like the stories grow, and then he was like his thing was to snipe the children of officials, and he felt guilty about it. And right, so Rotten.com decided that whatever dirt there was on Mr. Rogers, they were going to get to the bottom of it. This is a website that made their claim to fame by showing like graphic images of violent deaths and stuff. And so when you read the expose, you know, the guy begins with all of the conspiracy theories about Mr. Rogers, and then he looks into the man's life. And what he found was that the guy was actually just a saint, and he apologized for ever thinking otherwise. And it's the most touching expose you've ever read on the most vile website not run by Weave. Okay, so when I watch talks, I'm very impatient. And one of my problems with talks is that the talk is about some specific thing that's being hacked or some specific target. So you'll wind up with like a talk about Stuxnet, or a talk about this malware or that malware, or car hacking, or like thing hacking. And I'm the world's greatest fan of junk hacking. I really am. But it's because I don't care about the target. You can learn more about how to write an exploit or how to reverse engineer something from a good article about how to exploit a Tamagotchi than you will from the very best article about doomsday and destruction and everything. And as a devout Cthulhist, I know that like the elder gods will return and we're all going to die a horrible death. So I'm not really concerned about the security of my toaster. Instead, I'm concerned with cool things that you can do with firmware patches to the toaster. So today, my buddy Sergey and I are going to be telling stories. And we're going to be arguing a little bit. And we're going to be talking about all of the nifty tricks that allow reverse engineering and exploitation to be possible, rather than the end effects. And this is a reverse engineering discussion. If it ever strays into security, that's by accident and only because security comes as a sort of side effect of understanding how the hell something works.
Yeah, so the thing about security is that when you look at the mechanism, the vuln, the exploit, at some point just becomes an afterthought. Because you really see how the thing works and, well, how it won't. And of course, one man's junk is another man's IoT, or, you know, mobile health something. But that's really the thing. Whatever it is, it becomes a lot clearer when you have gone through the mechanism with the point of actually understanding the mechanism and forgetting about all the lives that you could ruin and all the laws that you could sow and, you know, all the money that you could reap.
So we're going to begin with, so I can't see you because of the way that lighting works here, although this has the best air conditioning of any stage I've been on. Like some of them are sweltering hellholes.
And look, you're right in front of the fire.
Well, exactly, yeah.
That works.
So because I can't see you, we're not going to do a show of hands thing. I just want you to cheer or just scream like as loud as you can. What was your first programming language? And don't be embarrassed if it's line numbered basic. Basic. All right, the basics have it.
Yeah, so, goddamn basic.
So basic actually came out of Dartmouth College, where Sergey teaches. And I had the opportunity to meet one of the original authors of it. And I went up to him, and like, I don't very often have fanboy moments, but they come up every now and then. And I gave this guy the most impassioned explanation of how BASIC is the greatest programming language on earth because of peek and poke. And then he looks at me like I've just insulted like his recently deceased dog. And he says, you know that peek and poke were designed by the microcomputer jerks and were never in the time-sharing version of BASIC, right?
Because, of course, the other thing that came out from the very same lab was the time-sharing system in which you could actually connect to one computer while being many.
Now, if Sergey and I, let's say that I'm a bit of a jerk and Sergey is a good neighbor, if we're sharing a server and the server is running BASIC as its operating system, it's not that hard to do cooperative multitasking around the basic instructions so that he can run his program and I can run my program. But there are these two commands in BASIC, peek and poke. And what peek does is it just gives you whatever value was at an address. So if you type peek of like 375, it goes to address 375. It's done in decimal just to keep you on your toes. But it goes to address 375 and it just grabs that byte and returns it. And what poke lets you do is it lets you write a value into that address. So if they had included this in the time-sharing version, then I could read out his projects, because I could just do a core dump of memory to my local workstation. This is why they didn't do it. Now, the microcomputer designers at the time, we're talking Altair BASIC from Microsoft, or Apple BASIC on the Apple II, or even going back further, the Apple I, they had the exact opposite problem, in that they didn't give a damn what security boundaries were between different users, because they're not trying to share the machine securely. They're just trying to allow hardware drivers to be written in the lowest level possible, or the lowest, the easiest language possible. So instead of having to write a driver in assembly language, you can just read and write the addresses of the floppy disk controller. And then instead of a driver in that architecture, you just have memory mapped registers. You read them and you write them.
So this really opens up your world, right? You really get to find out that there is an operating system out there, which of course crashes if you poke in the wrong place, which is probably the best lesson a budding student of programming can learn. That you crash not just your program, but the whole thing. And then, of course, you're interested in finding out how that whole thing works and what is it that you overwrote that crashed it.
So when you're learning to program the Apple II, you wind up with this. The first chapter tells you how to print "Hello World." 10 print "Hello World," 20 go to 10. The second chapter teaches you how to do inputs. The third chapter teaches you how to do loops. Eventually you get to like chapter 7, and they're teaching you how to make sound. And the sound chapter, I kid you not, says that you need to run peak of 3,695, and you run that in a tight loop, and it'll make a motorcycle noise. And you're looking at this, and you're like, you're shitting me. Like, why do I have to type in the direct address? But then you realize how much of the guts of the internal machine this exposes. You can do a ROM dump from an Apple II by sitting down at it, starting up the BASIC interpreter. My favorite thing about the Apple II is that if you don't know how to start the BASIC interpreter, you just flip the power switch back and forth, and then the voltage glitching of that on the CPU causes it to fall into the BASIC interpreter as a backup. This really works.
So some of us started our programming with a machine that had no ROM, because ROM was expensive. So what was in the memory was this program you called the monitor, which had just about 5 one-letter commands, which let you peek memory, poke memory. It had a really nice usable feature in which if you poked that memory, it gave you the prompt to poke the next address. And only when you type dot, it would dump you back to the main command line. And of course, your BASIC had to be loaded from an audio cassette. And there was a lot of it, so if a car drove by, then you basically had to restart because the line was too noisy. The BASIC, that way, was something that you could actually poke into as well because it was not in the ROM. Wasn't that nice? Of course, since it didn't have any kind of editing, then stealing the string out of the screen, which of course was just a byte-for-byte video RAM, and then poking it back after you have edited it using the very posh delete. It shifts the string over the character, so you don't have to retype everything else. Man, those were the days, right?
Those were the days, and there's no hitting the up arrow to just like get a previous command, or they didn't even have an interactive text editor. So instead, you would type a new line of basic code in order to overwrite the old one, and they were all kept as a linked list. Well, one of the things about a linked list is that it doesn't have to be in the appropriate order. So some of the designers, as a copy protection feature, would swap the order of the lines so that when you tell it to print the source code of the program, all of the lines are in the wrong order. But sneaky, right? But then you look at modern machines, and it turns out that these debug monitors that were used for debugging on the Apple II, they never really went away. They just changed a bit. So now they're called mask ROM bootloaders, and they're still in modern microcontrollers because you need some way to program the device for the first time. And as long as you're programming it for the first time, well, maybe we could add a serial port for that. Maybe we could add USB for that. And this feature creep winds up with a very complicated monitor with lots of commands that's also required to keep everything inside of the chip safe and away from prying eyes like mine. So if you're trying to attack microcontrollers and you're wondering, like, what's a good target, you know, the physical thing isn't the good target. The really good target, the reusable target, is to attack that mask ROM bootloader, because they have bugs. They also have the authority to read and write all of memory. And if you get an exploit on those, it's in permanent mask ROM and it can't be patched without $1 million mask revision at the fab.
So you have this moment, you know, that suddenly your life flashes in front of your eyes or something, and then the monitor lives, right? And that thing that you learned back then and thought you never actually will encounter in the grown-up life, it's right there. There's
also this concept when you're running through the device that there are these layers of abstraction, and you always gain something by dropping one level lower. For example, when you're working with a program in C, there are parts of even a language as bare bones as C that nobody really pays attention to until they're writing an exploit. One of the things that in modern exploit writing you need to understand very well is the behavior of the heap. And they don't make this easy, so you have lots of different heaps that behave differently. But you also have reliability issues with heaps on machines, and that you have memory leaks, you have improper use of the heap. This causes programs to crash, and it causes them to crash in like very subtle and long-term ways. By understanding these data structures, you are able to do things like audit the heap metadata. You can ask, like, is the heap corrupted? This is a question that a simple C function can answer in the blink of an eye just by running through the data and making sure that it all lines up in the end. You can ask this thing that I'm about to free, like, is it allocated and good to free, or am I just going to be trashing the state of the program? You can search for that. You can find it, and you can use these same tricks that are used in reverse engineering and in exploit writing to improve the reliability of embedded systems or host computers.
So like size does matter, right?
It does, yeah.
So in your typical heap, good luck doing that.
Now, when you're reverse engineering and you're looking at this thing, you get it into this this headspace where you're understanding every little thing about how the function works, and you don't really know what's valuable yet. So in the few functions that you decide to deep dive into, you wind up learning a lot more about its behavior than you think anyone would ever need, just as a side effect of exploring it. And there are types of bugs that we're taught to look for security reasons. Double freeze or use after free.
Or these days, zero references.
Yeah, zero references. But there are also ones that you're told are like an annoyance, but they're not really exploitable. One of them is an unindexed null pointer dereference. And I say unindexed because a null pointer dereference is exploitable if you can control the distance after the pointer. For example, if a very large array is malloc, and then you control which item gets written to first, if you can make malloc fail, it will then return 0. And from that offset, well, the offset is your real pointer, and 0 added to the real pointer gets you the real pointer. But when you don't control that index, you're told that this will hit a guard page, that address 0 will trap, and that the program will segfault, and that will be the end of it. So from the attacker's perspective, this should be useless. And then
Except.
Sorry, what?
Except.
There are these things called microcontrollers, and a lot of them run ARM code. And the ARM developers thought that it would be a really cool idea if the memory layout would reflect the source that you booted from. So in ARM, say ARM Cortex-M3, to use a specific example, your RAM will probably be somewhere around 2,000 and change hex, like 2, then 3 zeros, then 4 zeros. Your flash memory will be at 800 and change hex. So 0800 and then 4 zeros. And you can sort of imagine where these are placed. And there might be a mask ROM way up in the top of memory. And you have large gaps between these. So the ARM developers realized that you might write software that would run from flash memory in deployment, but you're doing a lot of different attempts at development. So you might develop it on a larger chip running from RAM so that you don't stress out the flash memory and you can very quickly try new revisions. So your compiler will just flush out an executable. The executable can then run either from RAM or from flash. And the way to make it do that effectively, they decided that whatever memory you booted from should be mapped to address 0. So if you can imagine the machine booting up, you have flash memory at 0800 and change. You have RAM at 2000 and change. And then down at 0, you have more flash memory, which is a perfect clone of what you have at 0800. I forget the name of the lady from Jeopardy, but Sergey, you're doing an excellent impersonation.
Why, thank you.
Vanna White, yes. Vanna White, ladies and gentlemen.
Cheers, neighbors.
So inside of the program, when you have a pointer that you're not actually doing anything with, the ARM compiler will put that in the BSS region, which gets zeroed at startup. So on ARM with GCC, any undefined global variable will have a value of 0 just by the way the things are arranged. So this pointer to a buffer might then point to 0. And if you can read that buffer, then you can read the very beginning of flash memory. There's a handheld ham radio called the Titera MD380 that I wrote a jailbreak for, which I published back in January. And the way that I got a copy of the internal bootloader that decrypts firmware updates, that exposes the rest of the firmware, is I found a region in the code that would dereference a null pointer and hand the data back over USB, and then I used that to read a complete copy of the bootloader. So these vulnerabilities that aren't exploitable on Unix are often very easily exploitable on embedded systems. Because the mitigations that you have, things like guard pages, or in a larger machine, the items on the heap, if they're large, they're separated into different pages of memory with guard pages between them. So you can't write off the end of one into the beginning of the next. None of that exists in embedded systems, which sort of makes them like an easier target. But it also means that things that you're taught to ignore on the host end are suddenly useful again.
So it's like you remember those skills that you learned as a child, right? Finding a fairy country in a wardrobe, that kind of thing. And you think it's all gone. And then they're back again, and like you just need to brush up on the skills.
Yeah, so hop on the Magic School Bus and you can play around with it.
Wardrobe, as it were, but yes.
I think in Fillery it was a telephone booth or a clock.
Search me, neighbor.
Oh, too many. There's also this concept that like we're taught to look for memory corruption exploits because they're sexy. And then we're separately taught to look for like web stuff because it's easy and it has a very large target, right? But there are other types of vulnerabilities to look for. For example, there's something called a parse tree differential, which is a pretentious way to say that two interpreters see the same file as having different meanings.
Pretentious, neighbor?
A little bit pretentious.
We gotta have some terminology.
But you're an academic. You're supposed to be pretentious. It comes with the job description.
Now you're insulting.
Dot, 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 dot.
Niet.
We're going to move on before I say some Russian words that Sergey's wife thinks I should never have learned.
That would get you kicked out of the house, neighbor.
Okay, so we've got two parsers that disagree about the meaning of a file. Big whoop. Like, how is this useful, Sergey?
Well, like the Android master key useful. So, what shouldn't you ever do, right? Write your own crypto library. So they didn't. So Android packages are verified, and their signature is checked by this Java crypto library, which is a bona fide crypto library written by crypto library people, and God forbid we ever seek to redo that kind of thing, because thou shalt not write your own crypto.
It's
okay.
Bona fide.
Yeah. So then everyone has PhDs, and we're talking some serious development effort. Okay, except of course when you actually deploy and it's Linux, why would you ever want to write in Java? Because like Java, right? Okay, so then the installer part is in C++, which makes sense. However, the package is zipped. So then you unzip it in Java, check the signature, then if the signature passes, then you pass it on, and your installer unzips it and installs it, because, why not? Except, there is this thing. Java really doesn't have unsigned integers, and C++ does, and zip kind of likes them. So those two streams of compressed data, they would actually disagree about. There were three, not just one, ways they would disagree about it. And one of them came down to signed versus unsigned. And what's that joke about Java packages, right? They make you sign everything or something like that.
So it goes.
So it goes. Anyway, so then you unzip in Java your package, and then you check the signature, and it passes, and it says great, so it's time to install it, right? Except when you unzip it in C++, you're seeing a completely different stream, which you happily install. So, what good is your signature? What good is your phone call if you can't speak? It's matrix.
I have no dial tone and I must scream.
Yeah, one of those things. What good is your phone call? It's Agent Smith, right? Agent Elrond. Come on. The matrix, the first and only matrix.
Yeah, it's a shame they made no sequels. They could have been really good.
Yeah. So then, of course, Neo's face just runs together, and he can speak, he can't open his mouth. Okay, so what good is your signature if you don't know what it applies to? And so that was the Android master key, the perfect example of why two things disagreeing about what's in a stream are a big, big deal, because that's part of the trust model.
And zip files themselves are a strange format because they sort of evolved rather than being created. When they were initially designed, you would have a series of floppy disks, or you might have a tape. And so they designed it to work with those sorts of interactions. Like when you have a large file on a hard disk, you want the headers and such to be at the very beginning, because on a modern computer it costs you nothing to rewrite the entire file. But back in those days, it was a lot cheaper to append onto the file than to rewrite it from scratch. The floppy disks that you have as your badges, these might take minutes to fill. And your zip file might stretch across a dozen disks. So rather than make you reinsert every single disk to add one file, zip files begin at the end and work their way back to the beginning. So you insert the very last disk, you append the one file, and the archive grows larger, and you just sort of like remove the old header at the end, or maybe you just append your own one without removing it. There's also this concept that you might be freshening a file. You might install a new version of a file that you have an old version of, and the old version might be on disk 6. So why get rid of it when that would require reinserting a bunch of floppies? Instead, the way that a zip file works, you just add a second copy of it. You can have multiple copies of the same file in different versions within a zip file. PDF and zip work together rather well. You can make what's called a polyglot by appending a very small zip file to the end of a PDF file. And if you adjust the records, you can interleave them and make a very large file that's both a zip and a PDF. And while you're at it, you can do more, because a PDF doesn't have to begin at address 0. It has to begin within the first 1,024 bytes.
So these are, I mean, all the things existed before they are discovered or recreated or something. So that's sort of a match for the standard distribution of a certain scholarly journal, the International Journal of Proof of Concept, or the other thing.
Or get the fuck out.
Or the other thing, neighbor.
Yeah, genau.
That has been its standard distribution format, a PDF and a zip, and then whatever else you can throw in, given that the header floats and gives you about a kilobyte to put in whatever elements you want, then skip over whatever other elements you want and say JPEG would allow you to do this. Any format that allows chunks of unrecognized data to be skipped would allow you to do that. And then there is a little zip thingy at the end. I think the most convoluted edition was the one that was a PDF, a zip, a picture of a cat, and a picture of another cat if you encrypted the file with a specific initialization vector.
Yeah, this used a trick called encryption by Ange Albertini. And the way that it works is that in CBC mode for block ciphers, which is where you feed in the output of the prior block and into the next block in order to make repeated blocks look different. You also have this thing called an initialization vector, which is what you feed into the first block. And by carefully choosing the initialization vector, you can make the first 128 bits you can make the first 128 bits after encryption chosen, which means that you can make one file encrypt into another file as long as the first block is the only block that is meaningful both before and after encryption. So you put comments in the encrypted version around all of the blocks that need to make sense clear text. And in clear text, you make comments around the blocks that need to make sense encrypted. And then you're able to have two files shared, in one being before and one being after crypto.
So that kind of changes your whole idea of encryption, right? Encryption is something that you put the thing through and you get something that has no sense whatsoever. It's just random garbage data. Whereas, of course, if you decrypt the thing and you don't have a key, again, you get this thing which is random garbage data. Well, not so much, right? It could be a picture of a cat.
So there used to be this disk encryption software called TrueCrypt. And TrueCrypt has a weird little header requirement in that the first block is the salt and the second block is the encrypted header. And you don't actually see the header until you decrypt it. This allowed for a nifty little trick, which is that you can make a legitimate file also be a TrueCrypt volume if your salt is the header of some file format. So we released an issue of the International Journal of Proof of Concept to get the fuck out.
The other thing.
The other thing, yeah. This is a bar. I think we're allowed to use more than Mr. Rogers' language. Although I think you are all very special, and I love you just for who you are.
Fuck you too, neighbor.
Fuck you too, SkyT.
Won't you be my neighbor?
So you can do this thing where like any file can be a TrueCrypt file. You can make a PDF that's a TrueCrypt file. You can make a regular bootable disk image that is also a TrueCrypt file by virtue of its file format. And this is one of the things that was allowed by the specification, but was never actually done until it was done as a prank. So maybe we should do more things as pranks and fewer things for the pwnage.
Well, maybe.
And far fewer for the politics.
Pwnage before politics. I mean, I'm from a country where, from a country that's long gone, but where apolitical was actually pejorative. You know, you're apolitical, you can do this thing, you can, go talk to people, you're not good enough for a lot of jobs, you're apolitical. Hey. But you pwn.
Chupone. So then these polyglots, like you can do them for files, but you can also do them for packets. You can make a radio transmission that is valid in multiple packet formats where the receivers decide. You can combine Wi-Fi and Morse code. Suppose that you control a web server that I'm going to through Tor over like 7 proxies in a firewall. If I'm to quote the cyber criminal song by Ben Nagya.
Oh, well, yeah.
So I'm connecting to this, and you are controlling the foreign server. You control the hidden service. Now, whatever data you send to me is going to be encrypted through Tor and through the 7 proxies in a firewall and that sort of stuff. But you still control the rate at which you send it. A little bit of latency is added by the network conditions themselves, but you're able to decide that like you're going to speed things up or you're going to slow things way down. And you can use this to hide messaging, and you can even use this to like send Morse code over my Wi-Fi channel that someone with a Morse code receiver on the appropriate band would be able to hear. And then you can look for this injected signal.
Which is not a nice thing to do.
It's not a very nice thing to do, but it works, and so there's no reason not to talk about it.
Using Tor is like a closed door, right? You just don't barge into the room, right?
Well, yeah. We'll see what Twitter says afterward.
So, in fact, you can do this with more things than Morse code. The Morse code is sort of like the lowest denominator of phi's. But interestingly enough, when you build a radio receiver, you build it to ignore the things that don't matter, right? So if you're building a frequency shift modulation module, so you choose those 2 frequencies and you shift between them to give a 1 or a 0.
So the high frequency is a 1, the low frequency is a 0.
Or you're building, then you ignore everything that's not frequency. You ignore the amplitude, so that transmitter may be going away, may be coming back. There may be people who are otherwise known as bags of water getting in between. You don't care. Your entire modulation scheme is simply frequency.
And this makes sense, right? Because anything that's not containing the data that changes, you're supposed to ignore because that's a natural effect. That's not the intent of the transmitter. So
same thing with the phase. You've got this sine wave going, and so long as it doesn't change phase, you've got a run of 1s or 0s. And so long when you change it, and when it's a cosine wave all of a sudden, then you've got a run of you've got to switch to 1s. So PSK, right? You could switch between 2 or 4 phases or however many you like. And in that case, again, you ignore amplitude, you ignore frequency if it floats back and forth, without affecting the phase. That's what you got to ignore. Now, let's say you are looking to talk to 2 receivers at once. One is doing frequency, the other phase. Could you make them hear different things from the same signal? And it turns out you can.
So a change in frequency turns out to be about the same as an abrupt change in phase. A change in amplitude very often gets ignored by these things. You also have transmitters that use frequency shift keying with more than 2 frequencies. They might have 4, they might have 16. It turns out that because of what's called the locking effect, it's always possible for you to inject down from a high number of symbols to an otherwise comparable protocol with a fewer number of symbols.
So like you have a transmitter with 4 FSK or say 4 PSK, 4 phases, 4 frequencies, and you want to talk to this radio which is just 2. So no problem, you can. Even though those radios were not meant to be compatible, they kind of are.
Now, when you're reverse engineering something, you have this problem that the thing that you really want in the end is horrendously complex. So you need to break it up into smaller pieces and learn them one at a time. With radio, this is a particular challenge because modern radio is getting as close as can be done to the limits of how much information can be carried over the channel. So it's very difficult to work with, say, 802.11n or AC. But you also have older protocols, so you could maybe work with 11b. Or you have this nice little loophole in amateur radio protocols in that they're restricted by narrow bandwidth to where they sort of have to be human intelligible with the right reverse engineering tools. And the right reverse engineering tools in the form of very nice software-defined radios and software for actually navigating the recordings are just now becoming available. Things like baudline and in Spectrum allow you to reverse engineer a signal in the same way that you might previously reverse engineer a core dump or a firmware dump.
So it's the way that signal corruption leads to interesting things, just as memory corruption is, just as memory corruption does. And so you have the sign, right? Misunderstood or difference of opinion between parsers. Okay, so there is something fun going on here. Or you see the sign, difference of opinion between receivers. You can bet that there is going to be some fun in that in the years to come.
So when I first met Sergey, he got me very drunk, and then the next day, I missed my flight back to the United States.
I deny that too.
Yeah, I missed my flight back to the United States, and I had to hitchhike home from Canada. So I'm like, hey, Sergey, can I bum a ride to New Hampshire? And he said, sure, but you do remember, after the whateverth round last night when you promised to do a fingerprinting research project. And I said, why the hell would I do that? Fingerprinting is boring.
Yeah, I mean, who the hell wants to know who just transmitted you this message? If you like it, you like it. If not, then,
When you get into it, though, what really makes fingerprinting frustrating is that you're paying so much attention to a signal and you're learning all the little details about it that you would do when you were trying to write an exploit. But at the end of all of that effort, you just say this signal is from that radio and not that radio, kind of probably maybe. The way to make this more interesting is to try and look for an exploit in it.
And the exploits are all on the receiving side. So
one mistaken belief that people have is, particularly in our community, you've all heard of the OSI 7-layer model. Just give me a cheers if you thought it was worth bothering to learn. Okay, I hear 3 people who are lying, and the rest of you are silent. But there is something useful in it, which is that the layers aren't like at the same positions as in the OSI model, right? I mean, you separate them in different layers. But this concept of like the guy who's designing the radio chip doesn't really care about routing. He's just trying to get a packet from point A to point B. And the guy who's doing the routing doesn't really care about the on-air protocol because he's just taking the interior of that packet and shuffling it from one spot to the other. So this way, only the low-level guy has to deal with the radio artifacts, and only the high-level guy has to deal with the routing protocols. These layers of abstraction become boundaries of competence, and like if you look at that dividing line, you very often find problems.
That's simply because whoever is handling the higher layer is trusting or assuming that the lower layer is somehow a magic validity filter, which would pass up only the right data, or the data exactly as it was meant to be reaching this point, or exactly as it was meant to be sent. And of course, in a world when just about everything is a polyglot, guess how likely that is. So that sort of the layer model is actually incredibly instructive, in which it tells you where the boundaries of competence are and exactly where gratuitous assumptions would be made. I mean, essentially look at this model as fairy stories upon fairy stories upon fairy stories upon fairy stories, some of which are believed. And of course, to you, to someone it's a fairy story, to somebody else it's an exploit. Because of course, an assumption, an unwarranted assumption, is the other side of pwnage.
And there's this thing where there are lots of things that you're told to, that you sort of learn in general, right? Like when you have a computer science class and they tell you that the heap grows upward and the stack grows downward. And you're like, okay, I know this fairy story. And then they come back to you and they're like, well, there are these things called threads.
Yeah, so you see, this is the moment in your life when you meet someone and you say, well, I'm a teacher. And he says, I know, liar to children.
Lying to children is a very valuable profession. No, it really is, because if the very first time you're told about the heap, you're told about all of the exceptions to the rule, that like everything that's so large gets created by mmap and is not within the contiguous heap at the bottom, or that every time you're taught about the stack, you're taught that you have multiple stacks per thread with guard pages between them, and that if they grow too deep, they die, so infinite recursion is probably a bad thing. And these details will kind of like bore you to tears until you have a reason to care. And as soon as you're trying to write a heap exploit that requires the two objects be adjacent, suddenly it's really handy to know that large objects are never adjacent to one another or to anything. So you sort of need to like file away these misconceptions that you've learned, and then later on in your career go back and try and figure out what the details are. And the best way to do that is to take these things apart. And the nicest thing about the era that we live in is that so much is open source that you can open up the source code and see how something functioned. You can take apart a heap. You can change the heap. You can rebuild all of Linux with your own heap rather than the default one and have all of the behaviors change as you like.
Personally, my favorite was the thing that I ended up calling unorthodox debugging, because people who invented it did not really have a name for it. And that was the idea that, to debug, you need to stop and go somewhere else. And that thing could be absolutely any fault or trap or exceptional condition at all. It did not at all have to be what your debugger uses, and in fact, you didn't know that the debugger used that until you actually started circumventing the debugger, because otherwise it was just this magical machine that was always there and that you never thought about. But then, of course, your breakpoint being your floating point exception gets rather interesting.
Yeah, so think of all of the different exceptions that can happen in a C program. You can have sig bus, which comes on an unaligned exception. This doesn't occur very often in x86, but it does on RISC processors a lot. So the idea is that your CPU doesn't necessarily have to actually implement unaligned instructions. Instead, your operating system can fake it whenever the request is made. You have sig fault, like a nice, well-behaved program will never read from memory that's not allocated. Will never touch a guard page. But you can rewrite it to touch a guard page and make that your handler. And then your program sort of crashes and you catch it and then restore it.
And then, of course, the question is, if you're doing anti-debugging tricks, right, which one of these things is a debugger? And you do your kill-L and you get your 32 signals, and which one of those is a debugger? And the answer is all of them.
All of them are debuggers. So you can bring your own debugger into a process without using the GDB one. You can either drop a small GDB stub, or you can just add your own methods for hooking and for redirecting calls.
So that was an epiphany. When I got this idea from the talk at Recon called the Silver Needle in the Skype. These were the guys that reverse engineered Skype to find the list of sites that it blocked and other interesting things that the developers did not care to reveal, and because they just made this concession to some friendly governments. And it was just an epiphany. It was this pot of gold. It was just this thing that was a steal. And unorthodox debugging. Whereas, of course, they had to write their own Ring 0 debugger, the Rust debugger, and I was so sad when the web page for that went away.
Web pages go away. It's called bit rot. When we're editing proof of concept or the other thing, which may or may not have been known as get the fuck out, a constant problem we have is that authors send in lists of URLs as their citations. And very often those URLs will bit rot within 2 months. And if they don't do that, they'll bit rot within 2 years or within 10. So much of the history of how to do reverse engineering has fallen apart. There was brilliant work done in attacking embedded systems that was only documented in closed satellite TV piracy forums that has evaporated. It's just gone. And we'll never get that back.
Yeah, this is sad, which is why, of course, every issue includes all the previous issues.
Well, we stopped doing that at Solar Designer's request.
Because he calculated that in 10 more issues, it will increase to the mass of the sun or the universe, perhaps.
Well, joke's on him. It's only half that large. So at this point, what we ought to do, but what we will not do, is ask you fine folks for questions. And we're not going to do this because when you ask an audience for questions, there's always some guy who's really excited. You know who you are. And he jumps up to the microphone, and instead of asking a question, he tells a story.
Yes, so, neighbor?
Yes. So we have just enough time for a 3-minute story. You can jump up on the stage right now and tell your story, but we're going to judge you afterward. Do we have a volunteer? I'm not joking. I'm not being facetious. I really want someone to jump up and tell a 3-minute story. I think we have no volunteers.
Well, in that case, we'll conclude with everything's a polyglot. Things that are old are new again. Things that used to surprise you as a young reverse engineer are probably useful in some abstruse Internet of Things thing somewhere, which is coming to the power station near you.
Well, okay, just to rephrase that last one. Every technique you have ever heard of works on some Internet of Things thing.
Techniques never die.
There's no exception to this. Somebody's going to raise his hand and be like, what about DOS exploits? Yes, some of them run DOS. Like
So techniques never die. So if you have a clever thing that is just this, a clever, cute thing, do not let it die. Document it, send it to the pastor at frac.org, to the Journal of Proof of Concept.
We're good Buddhists. We believe in cherishing bugs and helping them to grow instead of squashing them. And we need your help for that. I'm going to close this by ripping off a closing from Dan Geer, who is a brilliant scholar and a saint. There isn't enough time, and thank you kindly for yours.
There isn't enough time, and thank you kindly for yours.